Finance and Facilities Committee meeting. And before we move any further through the agenda, I'll make an announcement about live streaming. Meetings of the Mechanicsburg Area School District Board of Directors are being recorded and live streamed for the purpose of transparency and increased public access. The live stream, along with recordings from previously held meetings, can be found on the school board's YouTube channel. With that announcement, on to new business. Item 2.01, presentation of audited financial statements for the year ending June 30, 2023. Mr. Longwell, on to you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanker. So we are in the midst of budget season where we're looking ahead to 2024-25. We're working in 2023-24, which is the current year, and we're also looking back to 2022-2023 to say, how did we do? And so the audit really is, as we've talked about with the board over the years, the final culmination of, let's go back and look at our total revenues and our total expenses. The auditors will go back and test a variety of things. They'll look at our processes to see if there's any issues. And then they'll also affirm what that final result was in terms of total revenue and expense. They are independent auditors in nature, and so we work very closely with them, but ultimately they have a responsibility directly to the board and the community from a fiduciary standpoint. And so with that in regard, I'll bring Z up. He's a partner with Boyer and Ritter, who are our independent auditors. Before I turn it over to him, though, I do want to just recognize very quickly Mrs. Bobby Ely is here in the audience this evening, and I know probably doesn't want me to do too much recognition here, so I'll just try to keep it brief. She is our assistant business manager and controller. She does an incredible job in leading our day-to-day and week-to-week and month-to-month financial conversations. She works very closely with Dr. Lady and I on budget conversations and where are we with finances. And so I just wanted to recognize her for her efforts and also for her role in leading the audit and getting us through another good year, I think, here with Z. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, appreciate it. As Greg said, well, he called me Z, so I commonly do go by Z. My name's Sinai Zahirovich. I'm here from Boyer and Ritter, obviously, as the independent audit firm that conducts the annual audit of the district. Here to go over the results of that audit with you all. I'm going to start with the blue binder, the thick document that you have there in front of you. I'm going to skip right to what will be the result. Right after the table of contents, there's a page titled the Independent Auditor's Report. So within this 90-page document, Boyer and Ritter provides 3 audit opinions. One right here in front of you, and the other 2 I'll discuss shortly. But the first one's related to the audit of the financial statements. The other 2 are related to the single audit or compliance audit that we perform. Right off the bat here, first paragraph or the first section of this report is titled Opinions, and the second paragraph states that the financial statements present fairly in all material respects. The respective financial position of the district, the changes in the financial position, and cash flows, if applicable, in accordance with the accounting principles generally accepted in the United States of America. This boils down to what we call an unmodified opinion. It's a clean report, clean opinion, basically saying everything looks as it should. After that, there's the basis for opinions. We note here that we conducted our audit in accordance with the auditing standards generally accepted in the United States, or GAS, as well as the government auditing standards. So it's kind of 2 layers of standards that we have to follow when we perform these audits. We also note, as Greg mentioned, we are independent of the district, so we're an outside party coming to look at the books. And when we do conduct our audit, we have to meet our ethical responsibilities as laid out by those standards that we have to follow. Second page, then, we identify the responsibilities of the management team. So management is the one responsible for the preparation, fair presentation of the financial report in front of you, as well as for the design and implementation of the internal controls related to the financial transactions. We, of course, then come in and we're responsible to obtain reasonable assurance about whether these financial statements are free of material misstatement. Reasonable assurance is a term that's used in the audit world. Basically, it's not absolute, we can't come in at the end of the year and look at every single transaction that's transpired throughout the year. So we have to do sampling and testing when we do come in. So not absolute, but it is a very high level of assurance for you. And then we go through and kind of identify some of the additional relevant standards that we have to comply with as they relate to those generally accepted auditing standards and government auditing standards. Those are those bullet points there. Moving on, the third page. So there's, in addition to your basic financial statements, there's required supplementary information. The specifics of that section is identified in the table of contents. Basically, it includes the management's discussion analysis, the budget to actual of the general fund towards the back of the report, and then some schedules related to the pension and OPEB plans that have to be maintained within the financial statements. After that, supplementary information, we talk about the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. I'll point that out later in the report here. And then we have the other reporting required by government auditing standards, and that's the second report of the 3 that we issue, and I'll cover that in a little bit here as well. After that page, it is that management discussion and analysis that I mentioned. That's part of the required supplementary information. If you don't have time to look at all 90 pages here, spend your time here. It's about 10 or 12 pages, I believe. Read through that. Gives you a good overview of the district's financial position over the course of the year. Provides some comparative numbers as well as explanations of why some things happen. So that's a good area for you all to focus on. So I'm going to skip now to page 14. Give you a chance to get there. So here we have, as you can see by the title, the statement of net position. And this is your government-wide balance sheet. Assets, liabilities, net position, a couple of other things thrown in there. Some fancy terms used in the government accounting world, the deferred outflows and inflows. But basically, this includes all of your fund level information, plus it adds into it long-term assets and liabilities that aren't reported on those fund level statements. So really those long-term assets, like your capital assets, liabilities down below, you can see bonds payable, compensated assets, leases, pension, OPEB. One new item that's here this year is the subscription liabilities. So last year when I was here, I talked about GASB 87, and that was related to leases. This year we had to work with the district to implement GASB 96. That one's related to the subscription-based information technology arrangements. That's a mouthful. Acronym for that is SPIDAs or SPIDAs. So basically, these are contracts that the district has in place that are multi-year agreements to pay for software and IT, right? We basically had to take those contracts, evaluate them, calculate a net present value for them, and then we place a right-to-use asset and a corresponding liability. It's basically a zero net effect on this statement. But thanks to the GASB, the good old Government Accounting Standards Board, they're requiring this to be done by all governmental entities. So that's what that subscription liabilities item is there. From here, I'm going to jump a couple of pages, go to page 18. If we look at the title, you'll see again it's a mouthful, but basically it's your income statement for the governmental funds, general fund, capital reserve, bond construction, and the others there. I'm just going to highlight down towards the bottom the net change in fund balances number, basically your net income number for the year, difference between your revenues and expenses. As you can see, amongst all funds, it was positive increases to your fund balance this year. From here,
maybe one thing there, if I could just jump in. Up front there where we were talking about the government-wide statements and OPEB liabilities, that's a pretty complex statement and a very long-range focused statement. When we talk about finances at the district level, we often like to look more at the fund level, and that's really 16 and 18.
Yep,
so
exactly.
That's the general fund, the capital reserve fund, and what's happening in those line items. And
yeah, that's kind of your day-to-day activities are within those fund level statements.
And maybe to Z's point then, as the board's looking at 18, that net change in fund balance, that's a good line item. It's toward the bottom there, third from the bottom. That's a good indicator of what happened in the general fund, what happened in the capital reserve funds, what happened with our construction funds. Obviously, there's a big increase because we borrowed money.
Yep, issuance of debt, yep.
So.
Okay. So I'm going to go to page 21. So we just talked about the governmental funds. This is what's termed the proprietary fund of the district, the food service, your cafeteria operations. Two items to point out here. Basically, there's in the middle of this report, there's an operating loss item, about 1.7 million. And then you see just after that, there's non-operating revenues, state, federal subsidies that bring the change in net position, basically your bottom line again, your net income number, to a positive, an increase of 560,000. Okay. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all these pages. I'm going to make a pretty big leap here and head to page 72. So 72 is going to be just after a page that has supplementary information on it, nothing else. And this is where we get to the second of the three auditors' reports that we issue within these statements. This one, as I mentioned, related to the compliance audit, single audit that we perform. And we go right to the report on internal control over financial reporting. So what we say here is that we consider the district's internal control as a basis for designing our audit procedures for the purpose of expressing our opinion on the financial statements, but don't express an opinion specifically on the internal controls. It's really just the wording that has to be used within this report as laid out by the standards. After that, we kind of define if there were issues in internal controls that we identified through our testing, kind of what definitionally what that would mean. So there's a deficiency in internal control. That's kind of the lowest or most mundane issue. Then we kind of move up to a significant deficiency, a little bit more serious, and then material weakness, kind of a pretty substantial issue within internal controls. After that, the next little paragraph, and kind of towards the end of that, we state that during our audit, we did not identify any deficiencies in internal controls. So there weren't any deficiencies, no significant deficiencies, no material weaknesses in the internal controls. Moving on to the next page, and there's a section here titled Report on Compliance and Other Matters. So here we note that we did identify one item that we considered to be a non-compliance item. I'm going to cover that in a few pages where we kind of have the detail related to that. And well, preface that discussion with is this is the same item that occurred last year. It's a carryover just because of timing of when we completed the audit last year, when we did the audit again this year, just how things kind of shook out. We have to report what we see, but really the issue occurred last year. It was fixed last year, but the fix didn't happen until FY 2024 because of how things were set up.
And I think to Z's point, that's a little bit of, we're working in 3 years. And
Yep,
so
exactly.
when you're auditing 22, 23, we're often all the way already halfway through 23, 24. And so if there's an issue in 22, 23, and then we became aware of it in 23, 24, we're still fixing it, but the issue might still have existed in the first 6 months.
Okay. So move on to the next page. One more report here, our third and final one that we issue. So this one's related to the major federal program that we tested as part of our compliance audit. This year, again, we tested the education stabilization funds, COVID monies. Those accounted for about $1.3 million of federal expenditures. We also tested the child nutrition cluster, which accounted for about 1.8 million in federal expenditures, basically the two largest federal programs that the district has. First section here again, opinion on each major federal program. Second kind of paragraph of that, again, we state, in our opinion, the district complied in all material respects with the compliance requirements related to those programs. Again, an unmodified or clean report here. Basis for opinion on each major federal program, we talk about those generally accepted auditing standards, the government auditing standards again. And we add on a third layer or an additional set of guidance that we have to follow, and that's the uniform guidance when we do this type of testing. Responsibilities of management, that is for the compliance requirements related to the federal programs. And then on the next page, again, auditor's responsibility, obtain reasonable assurance regarding whether or not the district has complied in all material respects to those requirements. Towards the bottom, other matters paragraph, we again identify that finding from the previous report, we just have to report it in both. It's the same thing, nothing different there. And then last page of this one is the report on internal control over compliance. Second paragraph there, we have a sentence stating that during our audit, we did not identify any deficiencies in internal control over compliance this time. So the previous report was over financial reporting. This one's over compliance, just to distinguish the two for you. Again, noting that we did not have any material weaknesses identified during our testing. After that, we're on page 77, basically a schedule of the findings and question costs. As you can see, it's just kind of like a checklist of the reporting that I just discussed, as well as identifying the major programs that we tested. After that, on 78, this is where I mentioned earlier, we have kind of the detail of that finding spelled out. All the items that are identified here are required to be presented within the financial report as such. And if you were to look at last year's report, you'd see the same thing. Again, noting that this was something that was identified for the FY ending June 30, 22 audit, but because our audit was completed, or the work was done in October of 22, that's obviously in your FY 23 year. So that's why it ends up here again. I don't expect it to be in next year's report, so that should be the last that you see of this finding.
Mr. Longwell, what action has your office taken to make sure that this doesn't end up in a finding next year?
That's a good question, Mr. Stanker. So I'll begin with procurement. There's many layers to it. There's our requirements to follow what the state says we have to do when we purchase equipment and supplies in particular. There's also another set of standards around federal dollars. And so when it involves federal dollars, we still have to follow the state requirements, but then overlay those federal requirements and kind of cross-check to say, did we follow everything? As far as moving forward, Mrs. Ely has taken a more prominent role in our federal programs. She's done a great job with our ESSER funds, among other things, and our title grants. And so what we're planning to do and what I've already begun to do is to bring Bobby alongside from a procurement standpoint to help guide some of those processes. And so as we're looking at food service, because it does have a little more complexity with state and federal dollars, what do we need to do when we overlay all of those requirements and just make sure we dot the I's and cross the T's? And so that's an element of it. We've talked to other colleagues. We've talked to our solicitor as well about procurement requirements related to federal dollars. And so our goal, like Z said, is to get this tightened up and obviously out of the audit report. So.
Move to page 80. As I mentioned, I was going to point this out. That's your schedule of expenditures of federal awards. So total federal expenditures this year was about $4.7 million. And within that is included those major federal programs that I mentioned earlier, the education stabilization funds, the school lunch program, breakfast program, the child nutrition cluster is what the federal government calls it.
You look through 80 and 81, you really can see, it gives you a good breakout of that 4.7 million, and you'll notice as we head into the next budget, a fair amount of that 4.7 is ESSER money, and that's really coming to a close and drawing down, and so that's just something I wanted to call the board's attention to.
Yeah, that number would be decreasing with the finalization of some of those ESSER projects that were started. Okay. So that basically takes us through the end of the report. A couple of other pages after that, but it's just restating some of the stuff I've already covered. I didn't have intentions of going through the rest of the bulk of the report with you tonight. Certainly can if you guys want me to. But if you have any questions at this time, I can answer those. I do have a couple of, there were some letters in addition to the financial report I was going to quickly cover. Just going to take a moment and see if you have any questions regarding the report itself.
Any questions on the blue packet? Proceed.
Good. Yeah. So first letter is what we call the management comments letter. It's the 2-page document you have there. It starts with, this letter includes comments and suggestions. So here we are identifying a couple of items for the management team to be aware of for upcoming years. Basically, again, it all falls back on GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. They like to issue new pronouncements, new standards that every government entity has to follow. We're just making the management team aware of those, and we'll be working with them to make sure it all gets implemented as needed in future years. So there's a capitalization policy item and a compensated absences item that we'll be working with them to get in there. Then the other letter, that one's 4 or 5 pages there. Skipping over actually most, I'm going to skip the first page as well as the second for you here and move right to the third page. And just want to identify here some of the salient items, I think all of which are positive. We note that we did not have any uncorrected misstatements. So if there were any adjustments during the audit because of when some information came in, all those adjustments were made and included in the financial report. So nothing was left uncorrected, if you will. After that, there's the disagreements with management. I would say we did not have any disagreements with management, always a good thing. Also, we did not have any significant issues that we discussed with management that we didn't have an awareness of before or that we didn't have guidance to remedy. So no issues there. And then the page after that, again, another positive note, no difficulties encountered in performing the audit. Greg, Bobby, Kristen, the rest of their team have always been helpful throughout the entire audit process, making sure that we get what we need, answer all our questions, being available for us during our time on site as well as when we're off site. So certainly appreciate all of that. Thank them. Bobby, thank you. I know you're back there. So as I said, all positive items to note there. So that kind of takes me to the end of the presentation of what I wanted to cover for you.
Any additional questions from Lee while we have them here? It's a good report. Aside from a finding that we cleaned up, I mean, it's great news all around, right? That's what I take away from it, and I feel as though complex nature of things with federal programs, there's audit findings throughout the school district.
Yeah, it's not uncommon.
Nothing else. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight.
Good. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Moving on to the second item, the HVAC bid results at Elmwood. Ms. Blumwell.
I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Yeah. While we introduce it, Mr. Hoffman, our facilities director, will join us up here at the front table. So just by way of reminder, Elmwood Academy HVAC project included 17 large rooftop units. And so when we began construction a number of years ago, we really did so under the premise that as we designed the scope of our projects, we would take into consideration the useful remaining life of infrastructure and things of that nature. And so at the time, we wanted to see, we felt like we had more life left in the HVAC units in Elmwood. And we've reached the point where we know we're at the end of that, we've seen the end of that road and we need to replace them. So we had, through this last year, spring and summer, been looking at assessing the project. Could it be done in parts? Should it be done as an entire project? Really felt like because of the condition of all 17 that they should be done as an entire project, and that as a package, it also makes sense because you don't have to mobilize multiple times. There's expensive machinery and cranes involved and the work to be done. And so as one package, we had gotten some estimates that were closer to $4.5 million. We did get some good bid results, but I'll let Mr. Hoffman talk a little bit about the actual bid results, and then maybe about where we go from here in terms of next steps and working on this as a summer project.
Yep, good evening. We're really happy with the bid results, and we've discussed this potential project for a while now. The numbers speak for themselves. We'd like to proceed with this. Excited to get started. Hopefully this summer would be a full summer project at Elmwood. Start right after school lets out, and hoping that the majority of the physical work will be done early August, and then kind of tying things and wrapping things up before school begins. I don't really have anything additional to add. Anybody has any more questions, you have to answer.
The initial numbers we estimated were like 4.5 million, right? That's great.
Yeah, so 3.2 is going in the right direction, and a variance that we would like to see on all projects.
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
Attribute that to. I'm sorry if that's what you were going to say. Like,
Well,
what's
and I think, to your point, there is a large variance there, and I think one of the original questions or initial questions Dr. Lighty and I wondered about is, that's a pretty big gap. Was there something missed in the bid? Do we feel like this is a complete bid? So one cross-check or evidence that we look for to say, are these where they should be, is to say, all the contractors, were they pretty close? And they were. The grouping was pretty tight in terms of bids, and the engineers looked through the winning bidder, the low apparent bidders, and feels comfortable in recommending them as the finalists as listed there. And so our recommendation to move forward with the alternate that I'll point out, ionization, brings us to 3.2.
I'll be a little more blunt. We value the expertise that we get from the outside, but sometimes the answer's in the room. And with all due respect to Mr. Hoffman, he predicted this would be between $3 and $3.5 million. So he doesn't want to admit that, but I'll call him out on it as he knew where we were headed with this.
Yeah, it's always hard to predict with mechanical equipment how it's going to come in, but felt good about it when we looked at it originally, a year ago with pricing, and just want to be careful about it, but felt very good about the numbers that came in.
So where did that 4.5 number come from?
Our consultants and engineers, among others, and so Mr. Hoffman does a great job of managing projects in-house. As they get to a certain size, then we do start to lean more on our architects and engineers. And as Dr. Lay said, I think Mr. Hoffman's a very humble gentleman, but he usually has a good beat on things and temperature of it. But out of respect for, as we got other people around the table, and we had some multiple numbers from a planning purposes when we're talking about the capital reserve fund and savings account, we wanted to go with a more conservative number of 4.5, because you need to go to 3 and 3.5 and have it be 4.5. And does that impact other conversations we're having about facilities? And so we're happy, because I think this will tie to some other discussions we're going to have here with the board in the next few months.
And in this case, it was specifically the engineers.
Okay.
No concern about getting it done before the end of the year,
No,
before school starts.
I don't have any concern with, like I said, the physical work of removing the old units, installing the new ones. There might be some programming that lingers into the school year, but it won't keep us from running it. Just more of a control of tinkering with specific temperatures. We should be able to run them full blast and have air conditioning, ventilation. We'll be in good shape when school starts.
I think it's a good question, and once, to Mr. Hawkins' point, once the air conditioners just set, we can run them, and then it might be more about balancing them.
Run them in a manual mode. And that's aligns with what we've dealt with through construction. Is we get these things set up, it takes a while to get them programmed and software installed and set to where the parameters that we want them in consistently going forward, but they can generally run as soon as their power is set, power is hooked up and turned on.
Are the controls on these compatible with like our master controls that we have now? Are we going to
Yeah,
need
well,
upgrades on?
That's the Siemens controls on here, which is, yes.
They should
we
be
use-
compatible with other things like for remote monitoring and things that
Yes.
you have. Right.
We upgraded that like
Well, I knew we
in the
had
last 5
recently.
years there, right?
Yes, we
Somewhere.
did. Yep.
I didn't know where technology was, if we were gonna have to do like a,
It'll be compatible with what we have at all the other schools. Yep.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Mr. Hoffman, I just want to clarify that this is 100% of the rooftop units, that there's nothing left? So we're replacing every single one of them?
At Elmwood. At Elmwood, yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
And that we did just recently replace others, but this will complete the entire roof.
Correct.
How many units are on the rooftop then?
19 in total. We replaced 2 on the gym last year, and we're replacing the remainder of them this summer, hopefully.
I would imagine you would think that the 2 plus the 17 would all probably need to be replaced at the same time, further down the road. Same
Generally,
time.
20 to 25 years is the expectancy, properly maintained, and nothing out of the ordinary would happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so we heard timing of the project, and we're going to bring this forward for acceptance of bids at the next meeting. Is that the plan?
Yeah, Mr. Schenker, if the board is so willing, we would bring it and accept it at the February board meeting, which would give us enough time to get everything fabricated, get all the contractors in place, and then begin work over the summer. We've already been in conversation with Mr. Yu, at least preliminarily, to talk about what that looks like over the summer. We're gonna try to keep Elmwood as empty as we can, just so that we can keep work unimpeded. And then as Mrs. Huff had shared, and I think a good point, we really want to make sure we're ready to go for the start of school. So that's a big point of emphasis for us.
We have enough support around this table to move it to the vote? Okay. Great. Anything else in this item? All right. Thank you very much. I think that concludes the committee meeting. Moving on to the work session. Meeting adjourned. How about that?
good evening. I'd like to call to order the January 23rd, 2024 work session. I'd like to announce that meetings of the Mechanicsburg Area School District Board of Directors are being recorded and live streamed for the purpose of transparency and increased public access. The live stream, along with recordings from previously held meetings, can be found on the school board's YouTube channel. Move on to item 3, budget and finance. Item 3.01, capital reserve fund budget 2024-2025. Mr. Longwell.
Thank you, Mr. Up. So the capital reserve fund budget is probably one of the first budgets that we really begin to look at with the school board here as we move our way through budget season. The reason for that is we like to look at it in June and January if we can, so that we can begin projects in June and July, because oftentimes there's summer projects that are listed here. And so really our process begins with Mr. Hoffman and kind of assessing our facilities and saying, maybe what do we need to do in the next 12 months, often over the summertime, because the buildings, we do have greater flexibility. And so I will point out though, in addition to summer projects, there's also annual allocations listed there. And so, for example, we know the turf field usually has a life of 10 to 12 years. And so we allocate over a 10 to 12 year period on a straight line basis, some funds to replace the turf field so that when we get to that point, we've already earmarked it in the capital reserve fund. It's our savings account, so to speak. Likewise, the track is the same way. We know that the track is getting toward the end of its life, and we want to try to probably marry that up to some conversation about what's happening at the high school. And so we want to make sure we earmarked money there. I would say the one distinction between the turf and the track is that tracks have much longer lives. And so we don't necessarily set aside money every single year of the 20 or 25 year life of the track versus the turf. It is shorter. And so we do that. Normally with the track, once we get closer to the end, then we start setting money aside in that way. And so I'll let Mr. Hoffman talk through maybe some of the individual items here, open up to the board for questions, and then go from there.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions on the allocations at the top of the list before we move on to the individual maintenance items? We discussed the replacement of the HVAC units. If anyone has any more questions on that, I'd be happy to answer. The sewer pumps at the middle school, we'd like to make a full replacement of the pumps and the controls associated with those pumps. They are going on 22 years. At the end of their life expectancy, we've made small repairs to date, and it's clearly time to replace these pumps before a bad day comes around. Any questions on the pumps? Okay. The next one is the exterior door replacement at the middle school. This is a safety security issue with doors not closing properly all the time, and this is due to weathering and age. This isn't all the doors. This is the doors that are used the majority of the time, heavily used doors at the main entrance, guidance and musical athletics entrance. And these are just the exterior portion of the doors, not the interior doors associated with some of those entrances. These doors are also 22 years, and we've done a lot of work on these over the years, and we feel it's at the point where we really should replace, just due to the uncertainty. We never want to have a safety security issue with a door that can't be secured, especially at night over the weekend. It's kind of weighing on our minds for a couple of months. We'd like to move forward with that.
Mr. Hoffman, just does Greg and I reviewing the agenda, I want to make clear on this item. You're talking about the doors that face Market Street?
Yes, the doors at the main entrance that face Market Street, also the small set of doors next to them at the cafeteria. All right, and if you go the other direction down to the guidance entrance, those set of doors. If you keep going that direction and go around the side lot, there's a set of doors that goes to the music stage area, and then further down the athletic gym area doors, and those are the ones we were talking about.
So all the ones you just named, the whole way around.
Yeah.
And I think something, just to maybe say it another way, we're able to secure the doors. We have seen a frequency of repair, and because they are now 20 plus years old, we're feeling like those are the most used doors, the frequency of repairs. It's something we'd like to take care of this summer and just keep up with our facilities. So.
Just asked to orient myself, not
Yeah.
the problem with the idea of it.
Yeah, sure.
So I have a question on that, probably to Dr. Leidy or to Mr. Longwell, but I know we have a committee out looking at facilities and things like that, and this is not going to be something that is going to have to be changed again based on our anticipated outlook of things in the building.
Yeah, it's a great question. Last spring, the board appointed a committee to look at the next 5 to 7 years, which, believe it or not, takes us to the year 2030. And that committee is currently working and coming up with recommendations to look at what are the big projects in the district in the next 5 to 7 years. And they are aware of this exterior door replacement as a piece. In fact, when you see that, it will also be on those recommendations. And by doing this now, we don't see any issue with anything else that we would be doing at the middle school. There's not a connection between this and any other project that we currently see at the middle school. So we felt doing this now is important because of the reasons that Mr. Hoffman said. Before it becomes a safety and security issue, let's address it.
Well, I know as a board that we've discussed in the past, maybe making changes to where things would occur with the cafeteria, things like that. So that doesn't look like it would interfere with any. We don't
see that based where we are right now with that committee work and the recommendations.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, next item on the list is the HVAC mini splits install at the 8 network closets at the middle school. I worked with Mr. Faribault in the tech department with this, and this is to cool the network closets that produce so much heat. Originally, they were tied in to the HVAC system across the entire school, which doesn't really function well when it is heating and you're pumping more heat into a closet that's already producing heat. This is something that we've done during construction projects at other schools, and we feel that this is another item at the middle school that we need to come around to and make right to ensure that these network closets are working, functioning the way they should, and not overheating and causing a problem down the road.
Why, just to go back to the top there about replacing the HVAC units, we still have 4.5 million there, even though the estimate is 3.2?
We just left the estimate on there against the actuals, just to remind that the 4.5 million was what we've been talking to the board about in the fall. And so from a capital reserve fund perspective, now, to your point, Ms. Suff, the actual bid results came in at 3.2, and so it'll be 3.2 from a practical standpoint, so.
Thought we were trying to put a fast one on us there.
No, it's a good question, yeah, good question.
It will help with the next conversation. I will give a little preview there. Let me tell you, that's going to be nice to have that amount that Mr. Hoffman didn't need to use on the roof at Elmwood to do some other recommendations coming forward.
So
It's never free, right? Yeah.
Never is. And I think Dr. Light did a nice job of previewing it, and in the future meeting, we will come back with that facilities planning committee recommendations where we're prioritizing, here's a list of some feedback we've gotten from a diverse group of stakeholders to say, these are facility needs that might exist over the next 7 years. Here's how we prioritize them to short, medium, long range, because that list of prioritized needs or feedback we've got from the stakeholders will ultimately help inform the annual lists that we bring to the board to say, here's the upcoming projects from a capital reserve fund perspective.
And to our new board members, I just want to remind everybody is we re-review any of these prior to them joining them if they're over a $25,000 threshold. So these are not, it's not an authorization for them to go out and bid things and do that final smaller item. That something like these four in particular, all four would come back to us as the HVAC did tonight before they even begin to. So we're just allocating the money that we have another round of looking at it prior to it being
So we're
spent.
allocating 4.5 million towards.
Right. Or like the HVAC units for the mini splits. They just won't go out and bid that because it's over the threshold. They have to come back to us again to discuss, hey, we allocated this, now we want to do it. And then we would talk about it and then approve it on an individual basis, a line item basis.
I think the other thing we wanted to just briefly mention here quickly for the school board was similar to the HVAC units where we wanted to get a jump start on that process so that we could get it done in the summertime. The exterior door replacement and the HVAC mini splits, this list will be presented to the board for approval at the February board meeting, but if it's possible, we would like to look at getting a jump start on those exterior door replacement HVAC mini splits. We'll still come back to the board with the final results, as Mr. Rupp said, but just to keep those two projects moving from a timeline perspective so we can get them done over the summertime, especially the doors because there's some fabrication there. So we'll still board approve the entire list in February, board's authorization. And then as Mr. Rupp said, all the projects will ultimately come back for a final reading and award of bids at some point in the future.
And I have no issue with you going ahead and starting, prepare to do the project, to get the head start on that. So we've done a lot of that during our construction years here.
I think it's important when you have students involved.
Absolutely.
That timelines are met for the convenience of students, right? I mean, so, yeah.
Summer's a tight window.
Yeah.
Very
right.
tight window to try to get things moving as soon as you can to get them wrapped up by the end of the summer. And it gets tighter and tighter every year.
Further questions for Mr. Hoffman on the budget?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. And I assume we have enough feeling to move this forward for a vote in February.
Thank you, Sean.
Now we'll move on to item 3.02, General Fund Budget 2024-2025, Revenue and Expense Trends.
Yes, so each year we have been providing to the board in many ways what is a preview to what you're going to see over the next several weeks and and months related to the budget development for the 24-25 school year. So big night tonight for Mr. Longwell. He got to talk about, I think, all 3 years of the process that he's in with the audit and what's happening now, and also what we're developing moving forward. So I'm really going to just allow him to run with this, and he's very capable of explaining to you what these revenue trends are, but also the expense trends that we foresee being a big part of the budget development that we'll be doing.
Thank you, Dr. Leidy. And as Dr. Leidy alluded to, tonight is really the first part of a two-part budget process that we use with the board when it comes to the general fund, really looking at what's happening with some big areas in the revenue and what's happening with some big areas of expense, knowing that that will feed into our final budget proposal for 24-25, because we do closely monitor the trends, what happened in 22-23, what's happening in 23-24, because we know that ultimately that's going to feed into 24-25. And so in terms of tonight, we'll talk a little bit about the composition of our budget and the revenue side. So what makes up our budget is local, state, and federal, and what are the proportions of it. We'll talk about some of the biggest trends in revenue that I think the board's pretty well aware, and looking at what's happening and are there increases or decreases. And then also in terms of expenses, what's the composition of our expenses, and where are our funds going in terms of personnel, the debt service or the mortgage payment, if you will, purchase services, things like that. And then concluding with looking at some expense trends. The first two are really around personnel, and the last three, I would say, could tie more closely to PSERS and charter schools, certainly functions of mandates in law, and special education also a functional mandate and the need to provide services and what's happening there. So we'll start with revenue. And so from the board's perspective, I know we have a pretty veteran board, but we always like to start with just a refresher on, well, what is the makeup of our revenue, the revenue side of the budget. And so in terms of local revenue, it's usually right around 74-75%. Within that, real estate taxes and earned income taxes are a large percentage of it. At the state level, 24% is generally about what's there in terms of composition. We do, as a result of that, follow very closely the governor's budget. And so part of this multi-step budget process is we're putting together known variables as we speak. We're also monitoring kind of what's out there because the governor has yet to do his proposal. And so as we move toward March, we'll be monitoring that closely and then updating the budget to reflect those changes. And then the 1% federal is what's in the budget. I think obviously with ESSER, it's probably a little bit larger than 1%, but generally it's right around 1%. And as Z had shared earlier, and we talked about procurement as an example, the state has its own requirements. There's a whole other set of requirements with federal. I like to always point out that 1% of federal dollars is important. It's a chunk of our budget, but it also comes with a lot of compliance requirements compared to the rest of the 99% of the budget. And so that's just something that we like to talk about. So in terms of revenues, real estate taxes, this is assessed value. And so assessed value is a representation of what's happening in the school district with growth. And so I think it's probably no surprise when you drive end to end in town, the number of new developments, the number of, we have some new businesses, which is good, but how that directly relates to our budget is as assessed value grows, so too does the real estate taxes that are derived. So it's not us raising taxes, it's that new developments are going in and we're collecting additional revenue as a result of that. And so in general, our average assessed value growth has been right around 2%. You can see over the last 5 years, the average of that's 2.3%. And so this is something we follow very closely. We look at it month over month, Mrs. Ely and myself, and report to Dr. Leidy, because it is such a large percentage of our budget. It's something we track very closely, and it will result when we come back in March and we're going to have to adjust the revenue side of the budget because of assessed value growth. And so that's a good thing. The one thing I do like to point out, and it's tied a little bit to the 74%, that or 75% of local revenue that we collect. I think The challenge across the state is there's not like a one-size-fits-all answer, right? And so when you look at assessed value, it's good that we have growth. A lot of our growth is in residential developments, and so with that comes a lot of students. And so if you look at the last number of years, we've grown by probably almost 20% in enrollment. And so it's good to pick up some revenue from those new developments, but we're not putting in the commercial developments or the commercial properties maybe that the Carlisle Pike is capturing that don't have any students. And so with our revenue comes expenses because we're growing our budget to keep and accommodate a growing enrollment as well. So
Well, in fact, we can't control any of that. Even mean the township as much either, but it's not like we could decide we want to grow like the Carlisle Pike does and just, create 5 car dealerships, like that's just not, nor could we say no development. We don't want any more residential developments either. Like we're just downstream of all of the consequences of the growth in the area, right? And so it's
Or we can't say you're welcome to move in, but please don't bring your children.
Yeah,
with you.
exactly. Yeah, welcome to Mechanicsburg, don't bring your children.
So yes, that looks very nice, but I don't think it's a fair representation of, we'll get to it, we'll get to expenditure.
yeah. And I think the other thing before we move off real estate taxes too is there is an acknowledgement of the fair funding lawsuit. I think that has its own implications that the courts are going to have to kind of vet out. I think one thing that we've always been challenged by is the basic education funding formula is one of the largest streams coming through state revenue. A large percentage of it is still doled out based on hold harmless. And so school districts still receive what they received 10 and 20 years ago, regardless of what's happening with their enrollment. And so when a large chunk of that line item is still distributed the same way, but Mechanicsburg's grown by 20%, we're probably not seeing a proportional increase in state revenue that I would suggest that we should have legalized. I know people have different perspectives about that, but so more to come there. Probably not going to be resolved in the next year or so, but we follow that closely as well. Earned income tax. So here's another area where you can see growth is normally 4 to 5% per year. We monitor that at a regional and also at a state level. The Independent Fiscal Office of the state does issue reports about earned income taxes at a state level. What's interesting though is that 4 to 5% on average. We've seen more than that the last 2 years, right? And I think you can see that where employers are being pretty competitive with wages and what's happening at a local level. That's translated to, over the last 2 years, 10 and 12% increases in earned income taxes. I think the thing that we always have to be careful about with earned income tax is we don't want to start chasing the peaks of that because I can tell you that my 14 or 15 years in school finance, 10 to 12% is not, that's a unicorn. It doesn't happen hardly ever or not at all. And so much more frequent is 3, 4, 5%. And so that's back to conservative budgeting and the mindset that we use when we're looking at our budgets because we don't want to chase the peaks and then find ourselves in a bad position. So something that we're monitoring. That being said, I would expect that because of some of the growth we've seen, we will see an adjustment come March for earned income taxes because of the continued growth there. So. Interest income, this is an interesting one. Usually, you see kind of linear growth upward or maybe a flat plateau amount, but this is kind of a little bit different here for maybe the mathematicians in the room. There's maybe a word for this, but the dip there in 2021 and 21-22 was where the interest rates went way down, near 1% or less in terms of what we were earning. The interest rates have obviously rebounded as of late in 22-23, and we've seen a pretty significant increase in interest income. And so upwards of 700,000 or 800,000 was what we saw in 22-23, and we're still seeing some good interest earnings in 23-24. And so we'll be monitoring what does that look like for 24-25, but also trying to balance that or moderate it with the Fed, what's happening with the Fed, and they've announced some cuts and things, and so we'll work with some of our financial professionals to try to predict a little bit maybe where things are heading, and then budget accordingly. But it's good news in that we're collecting more than we have at any point in the last 10 or 12 years, and really a function of the market. Knowing though that could swing upward and downward pretty quickly too, and so we have to be careful about that.
And we also borrowed a lot in that trough, which is incredibly, I mean, we actually timed this.
But that's not
Amazing.
shown, this is general fund, right?
I'm,
This is
I'm
not-
aware,
yeah.
I'm aware, but I'm
Yeah.
just saying, I'm pointing it
From a
out.
timing
that-
perspective.
Yeah, from a timing perspective, I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's huge, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
I mean, these interest shows is both.
Oh, yeah.
Revenue and.
You're right, with low borrowing in here, but even on the proceeds from that were invested up there, so we actually did better than we expected for the bond money side, while we're waiting to spend it, so yeah, it's good.
I don't want to say it's an ideal situation, but to Dr. Wright's point, and also Mr. Sanker's, well, it wasn't necessarily great that we were earning that little of interest in those 2 years. That was 2 years where also where we were borrowing big chunks of money for our construction projects, and so maybe not earning quite as much, but borrowing 20 and 30-year bonds at record all-time lows.
Yep.
So that's good.
And I'm compelled to share with the board because Greg's too humble to say it. Yes, that's a change in interest rates, but it's also a team effort between Bobby Ely and Greg to look at how we're investing that money too. So some of this is related to increased interest rate, but there's also a significant portion of that increase that I call the Ely Longwell bar. And it really is only partially because of interest rates.
And that's not an insignificant amount of money,
And that's exactly right.
especially when you need teachers. So.
Good, very good. So in terms of state subsidies, the gray bar is our basic education subsidy, and that red maroon bar is our special education subsidy. And so a couple things you can say here. The one thing, basic education subsidy for a long time was kind of bumping along at 3 or 4%, right? And then you can see 21, 22, and 22, 23, an uptick there. And so admittedly, and in fairness, the state has put some more money through the formula, and we've been beneficiaries of that for 21, 22, and 22, 23. I do think we want to closely monitor that as the governor presents his proposal to say, is it going to be more like the last 2 years, or are we going back to that 3% a year trend that we were on for a very long time? I think the other thing around special education subsidy, that line's pretty flat over an 11-year period of time, and we'll talk about this maybe on the expense side as well, but we are mandated and we need and want to provide those services. I think the challenges at the state level, they're not contributing the same percentage they've been to those mandated costs that they have over the years. And we'll see another chart that talks a little bit about that. In terms of expense composition, I wanted to just, again, very 50,000-foot view, talk a little bit about that. So in terms of our expense side of the budget, 70% or thereabout is wages and benefits. And so in terms of our staff, things like where are we with our agreements, where are we with healthcare, all things that we monitor, and then we roll into the budget. I think the other piece is, as a growing district, again, back to enrollment, this is something that we flesh out through the budget process and come back to the board in March with some recommendations around staffing. We recognize that at the elementary level, if you want class sizes to maintain a certain level, but enrollment's growing, then the give there is you've got to add teachers, right? And so same with middle school, high school, programmatically. And so as a district, constrained in the sense that wages and benefits have some things that are already predetermined, but also that we're looking at a growing district and how we staff that appropriately. So the purchase services is the next biggest line item. That's 15.6%. I'll say there's a lot of things in that bucket, a lot of mandated costs. It's things like transportation, it's things like charter school, it's things like tuition to outside agencies and special ed costs, contracted services. So, but I would say generally though, a lot of mandated costs are there. The next biggest slice of the pie is other and financing at about 10%. That's our mortgage payment, if you will. That's the debt service. And so 10% is a benchmark that we like to look at. We like for that service to be right around 10% of the budget because we know that that's kind of a good place to be. We don't want to see that creep up to like 20% of the budget because it might start to squeeze out other areas of the pie, if you will. And so, again, benchmarking. And then the final piece is supplies and equipment at 4 or 5%. This would include everything from classroom supplies to technology, to facilities equipment, and so there's a variety of things there, but again, categorically, supplies and equipment.
If you
think about the benchmark, sorry, Mr. Palmer, if you think about the benchmark of 10% and all of the construction that has happened in this district, I think it's remarkable that Mr. Longwell and the team have been able to, through a financing plan, keep that at 10%. It's just, it's something the community should be very proud of, that those construction projects are not negatively impacting the staff and the teachers when you look at it through that lens right there.
This is a look at wages and benefits, and so the gray line is wages and that red maroon is benefits. And wages really grows by a function of those contracted salary increases, but also what's happening as we add staff because of enrollment and program needs and support services and things like that. You'll see the line tightens a little bit. I would suggest that some of that is PSERS, as if you remember, PSERS was running up, and so the benefit line was getting closer because PSERS is part of that. And also medical insurance, and so while wages themselves might grow by 3% a year in general, healthcare grows more like 8% a year. And so the benefit line is growing at a faster pace than wages because of things like PSERS and healthcare. And so again, as we look forward to March, we'll talk about the impact of all of those items, but I would expect that we'll see some increases in those areas as well, with especially knowing that personnel is 70% of our budget. So those are some of the significant line items, if you will. Medical expense. This one you see kind of up level. You add a trend line. I think the thing that is maybe most interesting to me, and something Mrs. Ely and Dr. Lighty and I have talked about, is you look at a 5-year average, it's 8.1%. If you look at the 3-year average, it's about 8%. If you look at the 7-year and 10-year average, it's about 8%. And so if you compare just 2 years, admittedly not 8%, but over the long range, it's right about that. And that's what our healthcare consultant said is pretty typical of larger employers like ourselves. And so I'll just maybe make a few connections for the board. When we budget, we often use 8%, 9%, somewhere in there, maybe a little more because we've got new staff that we have to account for. But that's a good benchmark for us because we know over the long course of time, it's going to be that. But in any given year, if it exceeds those expectations, we have set aside money in our fund balance. And so if you recall, we committed fund balance for the purpose of medical. And so if there's a year that is 20%, and we budgeted 8% or 9% or 10%, well then the backstop there is we do have money set aside in our fund balance to help us in that way. And so that's a benefit, frankly, I think, to the way we budget, is we provide kind of a little bit of a long-range security to it, that we can budget without chasing peaks and valleys, and we can do that because we have the fund balance to help us support us in that way.
It's interesting that the costs have stayed the same in the last 2 years, and they sort of won't always twin up like that, but they do in a bunch of the years, especially when we've been adding staff as well. Because I was thinking originally, like, wow, you know, every year we add staff, right? So that would push that line up. But
It's just the greed in the healthcare industry.
I was trying to get there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
You got me there.
I knew it was coming. All right, I just wanted to be the one to say it before
Greed in
everybody,
healthcare,
before anybody accuse me of anything here.
Let's put that earned income tax line back up against the medical expense line. Jeez.
I just had to head that one off.
Usually we don't look so far back in our trends, but I think to tell the story of PSERS, where it really was to where it is today, I think this is a good one. At some point we'll start knocking those 9, 10, and 10, 11 years off of there, but for now I think it helps tell a good story. So if you think back to 9, 10, you can see the bar chart there. The bars themselves are the dollars, which is represented on the left-hand side, and the red is the percentage contribution that we're making on covered payroll. So at 35%, said another way, for every dollar of salary, we pay 35 cents into pension. PSERS, we do get 50% reimbursement from the state, and so back to some connections to both sides of the budget, we will talk in March about, as PSERS increases, we do get some increased reimbursement from PSERS. But I think the thing I like to really look at is, at $1 million, half of that was reimbursed. So you're probably talking about 500,000. Probably 12 million is probably about where that 22, 23 line is, bar. Half of that, 6 million. So you think about the difference between 6 million and 500,000. At 5.5 million, a pretty significant amount to absorb into the budget over a 12 or 13-year period and resulting results.
And the fact that that's my tenure as superintendent has nothing to do with those rates. We don't control those, so we did find the money somehow.
Quite a coincidence.
Yeah.
Special education program expense and special education subsidies. So we talked a little bit about the expenses that we have to operate our programs. And you can see that in that gray line and how that's increased over the years. And then we did bring over that red maroon line from the revenue side of the budget just to offer some perspective, right? And so expenses that we know we need to account for, we know services we absolutely need to provide. But I think the story here, to me at least, is you look at the percentage in 2014-15 and how much of that they contributed toward, 2 million, about 8, right? And you can see how that gap has just widened and continued to widen. In fairness, they've maybe given us little bumps along the way, but not nearly to keep pace with what's happening in terms of expense. And so, again, I would expect when we do come back in March again, we'll be having some conversations with the board about where we are in terms of student services, special education costs, things like that. I do want to recognize that Mr. Bigham does a great job of tracking those things and trying to manage both in-house and out-of-district placements. He does that with a team. I know Mr. Fritz is involved, Dr. Lady, and others, certainly Mrs. Bott. But they are a significant portion of our budget, and frankly, all school districts. I think this is a very similar case you would see.
And the summary of that slide is the gap has doubled in 10 years, right? So what was a $6 million gap is now a $12 million gap, and we are mandated to do it. Obviously, there's a moral obligation to do it too, but you would think that we would start seeing something at a state level that would address this, and it's been a challenge.
I mean, just because there's a moral obligation doesn't mean that they should not help with that. This is shocking. This graph is frankly it's unacceptable in my opinion.
Constitutional obligation.
100%. I mean, this is the gap that we are. It's unacceptable.
Absolutely.
There's no other way to put it.
And when we go to like Harrisburg and talk with our legislators, I mean, a lot of times this is one of the issues we bring up, and they just don't seem to grasp it. And they keep just additional mandates and mandates and mandates. A lot we would do anyways because of the moral obligation. But they're actually mandating that we do it, and they're very expensive, and it's all but flat. And yes, there's been some increase, but not enough to really bump that line up that you can see it.
I mean, and to our credit, in terms of the services that we provide students, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're known as a district that is very, very favorable for students who need special help and special education. And so to see this graph, it's disappointing.
It is.
And it requires us to have, frankly, very difficult conversations about how do we meet these needs in the most efficient way that we can, because at that trajectory, you just can't keep up with it and building the plane bigger if you're not going to get additional support to do that. And so those are challenging conversations.
Yeah, and to your point earlier with taking, when a piece of the pie grows, it's going to take away another part of the pie. And for, I mean, with that growth, pretty soon we're not going to be able to afford to educate a student not in special education.
It's definitely a challenge.
I think Mr. Rupp did a nice job alluding to what we do talk to legislators about. This would be another topic that we talk to legislators about. Dr. Lady's smiling, as I know we put the slide in for
Smile or cry.
Charter school, so I think when you look at charter schools, we were hovering right around $1 million back in 11-12, 12-13. You can see the pandemic. 19-20 was really a freeze, if you will, because even though it happened in March of 20, PD came out and said no new enrollment schools can't be disadvantaged here. But you can see 2021 is the result of the pandemic and losing students to charter schools. 21, 22 kind of coming back down, then 22, 23 we're right at about $3.5 million. And so I would say there's a couple pieces to this. There's several contributing factors to charter school. Certainly, I think on its face, there's how many students are in charter school, right? I think that's certainly a part of it. But I also think that when you look at how charter schools are funded, they're funded on the expenses of the school districts. And so if there's 500 school districts, all 500 school districts have a different charter school rate that they pay maybe to the same charter school. So said another way, Commonwealth Connections would collect 500 different tuition rates for regular ed students from all 500 different public schools, and those rates can vary quite widely. So that's a talking point we talk to legislators about. I think the other factor, other thing connected to that factor, I should say, is because our budget's growing, our tuition rate goes up by 4 or 5% a year. So in some ways, when you look at these expenses, you would expect that you'd see some growth just simply because the tuition rate's going up annually. And then also there's the factor of how many kids are there, is there identification of special needs students at the cyber schools, because that changes the rate ultimately, right? And so for perspective's sake, our regular ed rate's probably right around 13,000, maybe a little more, close to 13, 14,000. And then our special ed rate's probably close to 28, 30,000. And so that's another point of conversation, is that when the charter schools identify the student, let's say the rate's 14 to 30, right? So there's $16,000 difference. Are those students getting $16,000 worth of special needs services, or because they've already been identified as special ed, they're getting the higher rate from the school, but are they really providing that extra level of service? And that's a point of advocacy, I think, as well. So.
It's like the third thing that you've shown that the legislators could fix, but choose not to.
This would seem to be the easiest one, though. Like, let's be honest, I think the other ones that we talk about are
Much more
incredibly difficult and whatnot, but this is easy.
And the agreement that is out there on how to fix it is amazing to me. Frankly, it's the other side pushing back in a very effective way, utilizing children, frankly, to make their point. And
The other question I would
thing is, this left like unethical years ago, and it's now criminal.
Yeah.
And the fact that we are forced under law to raise taxes, to pay for a child's education based on our expenses, not on the actual expenses of the school that's teaching them, is criminal. And I was told I was out of order when I said that to our legislators by our PSBA's lobbyists. Like, I shouldn't be calling them criminals, but they are. It's wrong. This is absolutely a criminal thing. It's theft. We're paying $16,000, say, for $6,000 or $3,000.
So a question for you, because are they required to have beautiful booklets like this at the end of every year and justify every dollar expenditure?
I'm sure they're audited, but I think the challenge is, we know, and they don't hide it. I mean, they share it. Like, a huge portion of their budget is going towards marketing, right? And that's legal. They're permitted to do that. I think what's intriguing to me is that you're now starting to see a movement where CCA, particularly, my understanding is that they have a desire to put a brick and mortar building in every county in the state of Pennsylvania. Well, what's that all about? Because part of the online piece that they're arguing about is, well, we do have costs. And to me, this appears like they're creating costs
125%.
to show that here's where that money's going. And I'll just say this, the last 3 years, 2021 does not surprise me at all. It shouldn't surprise any of us. We knew that. 21, 22 doesn't surprise me that we saw a lot of families come back and say, that's not for us. Frankly, 22, 23 does. That's a little bit disappointing from my perspective. However, thanks Mr. Longwell talking me off the cliff, if you follow a straight line, if you will, and cut off the most extremes, it's pretty much aligned to where you think it would have been in moving forward. So I think that it's still something we can address. I'll be perfectly frank with the board. We made a concerted effort in 18-19 to address this, and it took a lot of conversations, a lot of mailings, and that was the impact. And then 19-20, you see what happened. So it's a, I don't want to say it's a losing cause, but as long as it continues to be funded the way it is, the use of our resources to try to combat it, it's hard for me to justify that.
When we have this conversation every year, I try and check myself. I'm like, am I talking about this? Am I biased because I'm sitting here on the school board against this, or is this us or them? But it is a taxpayer thing. I'm a taxpayer in this district, a taxpayer in the state, and this is really frustrating that this is where the money ends up instead of here locally where it could do the best. And in addition, I'm paying 74% of, to the local tax that funds our school districts instead of 50-50 like we should from fair funding. And then the rest of it is we're paying above market or probably above the 500. I don't know if we're above or below, but it's different per district. That's really annoying too. That
And I think that's the piece, for me at least. I know people have different opinions about the effectiveness of charter schools, or should they exist. They offer school choice. I think if you put all that over here and just say, let's talk about the funding of it, I think it's like, this is clearly an issue. Like, funding model
They're
is
two
not,
separate
you know,
issues.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mind the competition.
Right.
I think we show the competition, not public schools in general, over a cyber charter
But
school.
the funding model is broken.
It's
Yeah.
the funding. It's criminal. And then he gets mad, I get more mad. Like, I mean, that's our tax dollars being given to an organization that based on their costs have nothing to do with it. We know what their costs are because we provide cyber charter education.
Not that I want to throw fuel on the fire, but I will mention it. The formula that calculates the special education, so it takes all of your special education costs, and then it gives you credit for 16% of your special education enrollment. There's a lot of schools that have more than 16%, and so if the numerator is a bigger number and the denominator isn't limited, then you can't take full credit for it. Well, the result is going to be you're going to pay a higher tuition rate than maybe what you should. And so I think there are some common sense things that could, like, why can't you just take credit for how many special ed kids you do have? Because that is a direct reflection of the cost you're paying, right? So,
And I'll just, to your point about, let's not be partial on this, right? Let's say that, listen, the education they're providing to the kids is just as good as the education we can provide. It's not, but let's just say it is. And let's just say that we don't have a choice. This goes to Mr. Rupp's point. Then we should pay what it costs, not what it costs us to educate children in this district. We should pay what it costs. That won't impact the children receiving the services at all, but it will definitely impact the bottom line for these organizations that have a fund balance that's so large that they have to go start building buildings to spend the fund balance. So, I'm done.
The irony, and we're not saying that, this just gets me so mad, is that we're being mandated to pay our competition so that they can market against us
In law.
and lobby against us and to get more of our money. Anyway.
And it's across the entire political spectrum, both parties. It's.
But school choice gets put into this, and that's bogus, because
They're
this has
two
nothing to do
entirely
with school
different
choice.
things. I'm all for school
Yeah,
choice.
100%,
That's fine.
right? If
We'll
we don't,
compete
if we're
with
not
anybody.
performing, fine. But that's not what this is.
Right. Thank you for putting the slide in strong.
That's a spirited conversation.
I would just like to add, I remember when the budget, we had to put $1 million. We hit the $1 million. We were waiting and waiting. And finally, one year, we hit $1 million. But in 10 years, we're almost at 4 million. So we've almost like quadrupled the amount of money we're giving it in 10 years. And it's insane.
Absolutely, Tracy.
And Dr. Lottie, you mentioned the work that you did in 18 and 19, and it did have some monetary impact. I'm not saying, go just spend all time and resources on that, but there is value from the educational outcome that we know overall from those districts, or from the charters, and there is some value to it, and if we can kind of, what we can do to keep things in check that's reasonable, I think that's worthwhile.
I don't disagree.
Okay, that concludes my presentation.
Thank you for a fine report, almost fine report. One little issue. And with that, we'll move on to 3.03, Cumberland Perry Area Career and Technical Center Budget 2024-2025. Mr. Longwell.
Mr. Longwell, Tracy has her hand up. I don't know if it's still, if that was from your last comment.
Oh, it was from before, okay. Okay, yep, there.
I cleaned the house, sorry.
The CTC budget is attached for the board's review. I think, like I normally do, we'll just call out a couple areas, I think, for the board's particular consideration. If you open the PDF, I would refer you to PDF page 14, which at the very bottom is actually printed as 9. That is the document that shows all of the sending districts to the CTC. It also shows the enrollment for each of the last 5 years. And so the significance of that is the rolling ADMs over a 5-year period contribute directly then to what percentage of the CTC's budget do the districts, the sending districts, contribute. And so if you kind of move from that PDF page 14 down to PDF page 15, which at the bottom is actually printed 10. Sorry, I know that's a little confusing, but you can then see, based on those percentages that are developed on the prior page, what is the district's cost for 24-25, what was the district's cost for 23-24, and you can see from Mechanicsburg's perspective, our budget for 24-25 will include $585,946, which is an increase from $507,729, and you can see in part because of the increasing enrollment there at the CTC, and so we would just share a larger percentage of the budget, which I think you could suggest is a good thing. If we're sending students there, I recognize the budget increase is a function of that, but we're also giving students.
But to our earlier point, in this case, we don't mind this because we're sending a student to something that we don't provide. We're getting a different kind of education, but it's based on the cost of providing that education.
And one, I was going to point this out as well. We were talking about educational choice.
Right.
And this is an example of a phenomenal
Absolutely.
example of students being able to choose how they want to be taught. And so let's use this as a really great expense to the school district, and the other one as you would put it, criminal.
I think.
I'm
right.
sorry, Mr. Long, go ahead.
No, that's okay. That's
All
okay.
I want to say on this chart, I think I said this before, that I think we're getting a really good deal right now in terms of where we are with the ADMs, and dropping 50, but adding 99 or whatever we did on the prior page, we're still like in a really good spot. That may even out over time, but you know, the fact that we are also locked in on the facility project at this point is really good for us. So
It'll take 4 or 5 years for it to finally catch us.
yeah, it will. Yeah.
That really was what I wanted to focus on. Obviously, the entire report there is for the board's review, but from a practical standpoint, in terms of what it means for Mechanicsburg and then ultimately our budget that we'll be coming back to you in March with, it's those 2 pages I would focus mostly on.
Further questions to Mr. Longwell in the Cumberland Perry area budget? Then we'll move that forward for a future meeting. Move on to item 7, policy. I'm going to read the first 2 into the record and let Mr. Longwell discuss those, and then we'll go to Dr. Light. Item 7.01, first reading of revised board policy 001, name and classification. 7.02, first reading of revised board policy 005, organization. Mr. Longwell.
Thank you. So for the board's perspective, I would say there is some relationship to the changes in both 001 and 005. I think we had shared in some previous communication to the board that the district had received notice that because of the population increase within our footprint, the township and the borough in particular, that we have crossed a threshold that we'll now be classified as a Class 2 school district instead of a Class 3 school district. And so that's really the biggest change that you see in 001. And then I think based on that, as we were reviewing it, the very next question is, well, what does that mean for us as a school district if we're changing classes, right? And so I think in working with our solicitor, Gareth Poca, really from a practical standpoint, the most significant change is that the board treasurer cannot be, that position cannot be filled by one of the elected 9 board directors. And so typically what you see is that's an administrator or a staff member from the school district. And so as the board reviews these 2 policies, both of them would be effective July 1 because that's the effective date of the change from PDE, the notification we received. We would be coming back administratively with Dr. Lady at a future meeting to recommend who might fill that role as board treasurer. And then from a practical standpoint, I know Ms. Morgan had some responsibilities in terms of looking at checks and so forth as part of the treasurer's report. I know Mr. Rupp's looking at committee assignments and things, and I think there's still a way to work through that we can still have a good system in place. And so that's our recommendation from a policy perspective, and then the implications of the changes. So,
And then the appointment has to take place prior to July 1st.
so yeah, we would
Of the
see
new
probably the treasurer, treasurer appointed, May, I think was maybe what policy says. And so sometime in that time frame. Right?
Yeah, because May is when they have to be done, correct? And that would, at that point, we would just go with the new, correct? Any questions, Mr. Longwell, on policy 7.01 or 2? Thank you, Mr. Longwell. 7.03, first reading of revised board policy 008, table of organization. Dr. Leidy.
Yes, so this is not your typical policy. As you can see by the attachment, we've taken the liberty to work really hard to try to explain not only to the board and the community, but even to new employees, what is the organizational structure of our district. And you may recall that a few years ago, we had all these little boxes with dotted lines and straight lines and all over the place. We actually spent considerable amount of time talking about this philosophically. And so the first page of this, you see that there is a leadership structure that's not designed really as a hierarchy, but to show the leadership components of the district in the gray boxes there, starting with the Board of School Directors and going through Superintendent Cabinet, principals, district administrators, and then our professional and support staff, which was not represented, in my opinion, adequately on the org chart previously. Then you go down and you see the departments and the 3 areas identified that have a further breakout on the subsequent pages. If you go down to the second page, you'll notice that that is a more traditional org chart with the district leadership, again with the Board of School Directors at the top, the superintendent and cabinet represented on that page, along with our building leadership. And you'll notice some information on there that speaks to responsibilities and roles that's included. Then the next several pages are from the departments, a further breakdown of the academic program on page 3, student services on page 4, and the district operations and support on page 5. So it is obviously much more than what we've had, but I think it is indicative of the work that happens in the district and truly represents the organizational structure, which is what this policy calls for. And it is inclusive of our employees, not just administrators in the district, which again, we know we couldn't function without our support staff and our teaching professionals. So pretty proud of this and thankful to Cabinet for working through this to be able to provide it to the board for your approval.
First, I want to say, in all my years on the board, whoever designed this chart, I think we owe them a huge thanks. I mean, this really, for the first time, makes it very simple for anybody to, whoever's doing our graphic design. I kind of suspected it was him. Or,
little known that he has an art and design background.
say, yeah,
So.
a minor in art. But
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, we can look at this and know exactly where everybody is and the structure of that.
Are you available to do this for other ones?
So with that note then, Dr. Lai, I do have a quick question.
Sure.
I see our Director of Human Resources is always just off to the right of the Chief Fiscal Officer. Is that because of the fact that, is that due to the school code and how the law is written?
No, it's not a school code issue, but Mr. Longwell does supervise Mrs. Stata in our current structure. And some of the rationale behind that is a large portion of our staff, support staff, actually, Mr. Longwell is accountable for their performance and their evaluations, if you will, ultimately. As superintendent, I take care of the professional side of that, and so that's just the structure that we have in this district.
So she just doesn't fall into like the tree on page 5?
Correct. Yeah, she's a member of our cabinet, and she sits in cabinet meetings, and so
Okay.
she contributes to the overall operations from that
But
perspective.
in a daily operation, she would directly fall under the Chief Fiscal Officer.
That's correct. Yeah. Great question.
My comment would be that although this might seem a lot more complicated than previous, I've always appreciated that every time a position becomes available or vacant, you don't automatically fill it, and you also look to see how you can, I mean, a lot of times districts, the administration office, it just grows and grows and grows. But you're always looking to be most efficient and be a good steward of the taxpayers' money. So while this looks more complicated, you, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you have really been, you've condensed this whole structure so that it is the most efficient for the district. Is that right?
Yeah, and
Good
oftentimes to the chagrin of the person that has to pick up 2 roles for a certain period of time, and what that looks like. But yes, we are very purposeful about, just because a position open, we're not going to automatically fill that. And I think that's, to Mr. Longwell's credit, he has said to me now, probably 3 years, we really should get an org chart in front of the district, or in front of the board. And I said, well, we're going to have to make sure we know what it looks like before we get in front of it.
So I have a kind of a question here. Just if I'm reading this correctly, under Mr. Longwell, there's a lot of direct reports spanning a wide range of. In other areas, some of those offshoots are supporting other people, it would appear, but there, it's pretty much all coming to him. Is that, I guess, is that a cause for concern? Are there pieces here that aren't, are there reporting structures that aren't reflected on that piece? That one seems a little bit.
It's an excellent question. And I would say this, that he's very capable of that and doing that. It's also one of the reasons that we looked a year or so ago at bringing in more help with Mrs. Ely's position, if you recall. And so this I don't see as written in stone for the next 5 years. I think that will continue to evolve. And Mr. Bitz's graphic arts skills may continue to go with that. But the other piece to it that I think's really important, and I'm happy that you pointed this out, if you can visualize in your mind the concentric circles that we talked about through human resources, where the students are in the middle, and then the individuals that directly impact the students are the next concentric circle, meaning our teachers and our aides and those kinds of individuals. And then there's this next layer out, which is our building administrators and district office and so on. And then there's this next layer out, which is our support team, right? And so probably furthest removed from the students, yet a critical component. And so when we started adapting to the growing enrollment in the district, we started with the individuals closest to the students and most impactful to the students, and we increased the number of teachers in the district. What has happened in the last couple of years now is you see we're working more on those concentric circles on the outside. And so we've added additional help in transportation and food services in the recreation department. A lot of the areas that you see listed on here, we're adding additional support to those areas to not only assist Mr. Longwell, but to allow the people who you see listed here to take on more of a leadership role than just simply an operational role. So.
Because and again, I get that org charts don't always, maybe it's tough to make them reflect reality sometimes. The other ones seem very clean to me. The fact that technology, facilities, athletic director, food services, et cetera, report to the chief financial officer, Like that's not intuitive.
Right.
It looks like that's a catch-all.
It probably is.
So
It probably is.
Again, I don't, yeah, just,
Well, if you treat it as all the instructional people report to Dr. Leiby, all the teachers and those who directly touch the students in your concentric circle example, right? Like I would also kind of ask the same question that way, like, okay, you've got, Greg has a whole team that report up to him, but you also, this is the same question that we've discussed before too, like the layers between you and the rest of the administrative team have been more streamlined lately, and maybe this isn't a public discussion at a certain level, but I would almost be, I'm not trying to divert away from your question, Lane, but I almost think like Greg's one thing, but Dr. Leidy has like a whole other half, or then some to oversee. So I have the same concern there, making sure that you're adequately supported.
so to me, it's not just about, I agree with that, but it's like, I guess my question would be, does chief fiscal officer make sense for those other, for all those?
Mhm.
Because I see the connections when I look at your reports,
Mhm.
when I look at Mr. Bitz's, that, why is the athletic director and the transport, like,
Sure.
is there a better title?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, so let's go to athletic director, because I think that's a great one. The athletic director actually reports directly to the high school principal, right? So the athletic director being one there really is more about the facilities component of it and the financial components of that than it
Okay.
is about a direct report. So even though it's on there, you'll notice it's a dotted line.
Yes.
Which we couldn't get away from him completely. But it also provides for Mr. Pahanic, in this case, a team, if you will, to talk to. So when you think about, again, transportation and the involvement with the athletics and transportation, or within the facilities and the usage of facilities, or the rec department, that is a great fit for Mr. Pahanic to be part of that team structurally, if you will. But as a matter of fact, Mr. Pahanic's supervisor is Mr. Reedy, not Mr. Longwell. And then to your other point about some of these, we have over the years tried different versions of this. We've moved transportation and brought it back. We moved technology and brought it back, because what happens is other places in the org chart, it tends to get lost or become a secondary item and not get the attention that it can. And so I would look at it through this lens, that this isn't just about Mr. Longwell as a supervisor. This is about this team of people working together and meeting together to provide the support services for the district.
Okay. And ultimately, I think all of our hope would be that this is functional.
Mhm.
So I understand that it's just, all the other ones make sense so well,
Mhm.
and I think it does a great job of that. That one I looked at and was like, yeah, no point to see that.
Yeah, it's
So
fair.
your explanation has been helpful.
But you're empowering each leader of each one this as a leader in and of themselves. And we all know that organizations function better when you empower people to be leaders and have ownership to this. So it's not necessarily like you look at this and say, this person takes an hour of your day, this person takes an hour of your day, this person takes an hour of your day. Well, that's already 8 hours. What the heck now to time you? That's not the way it is, right? We've empowered them to do their job effectively.
We've empowered them, and I think as much, if you will, it's a meeting and a team structure and a cadence to those meetings that I think is benefiting the district tremendously. So cabinet meets in a meeting cadence, right? We have huddles, we have full meetings, and then periodically we bring in principals to cabinet who represent the K-12. And then periodically we bring in the entire administrative team and have meetings. And so the whole idea of the structure is to improve efficiencies and effectiveness in communications. And so a lot of what you see here isn't just about a hierarchy associated with supervision. It's about this idea of a team and who's working together within the organization.
With that explanation, it makes a lot more sense.
I like that.
yet, so.
And I think to Dr. Rhodes' point maybe, I think it's absolutely right. In any given day, not talking to all 7 of them, and they're capable administrators in their own right, and they know the direction, and I think Dr. Lay articulated well that structure, albeit they are very different departments, when you gather them together, there's a lot of like and similar things that we talk about that lap over into their areas, and so we talk about like summer program locations and where we're operating different things, well, has implications for athletic and rec and transportation and food service and tech. And so when we have that conversation, to Dr. Lay's point, at that meeting, it's about one of coordination and how we're binding all of these things together. And so that's just one example.
Other questions on 7.03? Seeing none, meeting is adjourned.